Administration as chaotic as this one, it can sometimes be hard to tell on a day-to-day basis when things are going bad in just kind of a run-of-the-mill way versus when things are going bad in a not at all run-of-the-mill, maybe actually consider panicking kind of way. It's hard to tell sometimes on a day-to-day basis. But one of the good indicators that something really big is going wrong is when you get news that people who have really big jobs in one part of the government, they all leave. They all quit or are fired suddenly, all of a sudden and without warning. And it's because they had been trying to stop something from happening. They weren't able to stop that thing from happening. And so now they have left the agency. They have left the government.
Hey friends, Jack here. Let's talk real stuff. In December 2022, a Manhattan jury convicted the Trump Organization and its payroll corporation on 17 criminal counts, tax fraud and falsifying business records, after prosecutors obtained Trump's tax returns and accounting records from Mazars. The conviction exposed a 15-year pattern of systematic tax evasion, including off-the-books perks for executives and 2 sets of books, fundamentally altering Trump's legal and financial vulnerability. And that was the first time in Trump's career that his company was actually charged, tried, and convicted on criminal charges. The first time ever. That's historic. That's huge. That's a big deal. And then the judge ordered Trump's company to pay $1.6 million in fines.
That is a pretty reliable sign that something quite big and quite bad is happening. And you only see these things every so often, even in an administration as disastrous as this one. For example, there were the senior prosecutors who resigned after the Justice Department ordered them to drop the corruption case against New York City's mayor. There was the longtime official who resigned from the Treasury Department after people working for the president's top campaign donor demanded access to the most sensitive payment systems in the whole U.S. government. There was the top official for vaccine safety in the whole U.S. government who said he would not give Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and his new team unrestricted read-write access to a very sensitive central vaccine database. And again, I'm no expert, but
fines. $1.6 million, the maximum fine allowed under New York law. The maximum. So Trump's company didn't just get convicted. Trump's company had to pay real money, had to pay the maximum penalty, had to suffer real financial consequences for the crimes they committed. Now, let me explain how prosecutors actually proved this case, because this is crucial to understanding why this is so devastating. Prosecutors didn't have to guess. Prosecutors didn't have to speculate. Prosecutors had the documents. Prosecutors had the paper trail. Prosecutors had Trump's own accounting records that showed exactly what happened. That's why the case was so devastating. That's why the jury convicted on all counts, because the evidence was right there in the documents. Mazars USA prepared Trump.
I feel like I can measure the size of the splash that's being made by this particular cannonball at the IRS by the news of who is leaving the agency all of a sudden and without warning because of something going wrong there. This news started to come in last night, just as we were getting off the air, when we got news that the acting head of the IRS was gone. She had resigned over a Trump administration plan for the IRS to give sensitive tax data to immigration authorities, so the Trump administration can use it to target immigrants. This woman had been acting commissioner for less than 6 weeks. She had been appointed after Trump's previous acting head of the IRS also abruptly resigned in another controversy. That alone is a bad sign. But apparently she was not the only senior person at
tax returns for decades. Mazars kept Trump's books. Mazars created the financial statements. Mazars had all the records, all the internal worksheets, all the communications about how they prepared the returns, everything. And when prosecutors got those records, they could see exactly what was happening. They could see the 2 sets of books. They could see the off-the-books payments. They could see the hidden perks. They could see the whole fraud scheme laid out in the accounting records. Mazars is a real accounting firm. Mazars is a legitimate, established accounting firm. Mazars isn't some fly-by-night operation. Mazars had been working with Trump for decades, so these weren't amateur records. These weren't casually kept books. These were professional accounting documents
the IRS who left because of this standoff. The New York Times then reported that the IRS's chief financial officer, the IRS's chief of staff, the IRS's chief risk officer, all have also resigned in recent days. Same with the IRS's chief privacy officer. The top lawyer at the IRS was also reportedly demoted recently, as this plan to use tax data to target immigrants was starting to come together. Now, that's a lot of people to have to fire your way through, right? Whatever the reason for all these high-level resignations, whether it's to stop this plan for using tax data to go after immigrants, I don't know. I feel like I need to understand why that is so dangerous and why so many people, including people elevated during the Trump administration,
prepared by a real accounting firm. And those documents proved that the Trump organization was committing crimes. That's what made the conviction so powerful, because the evidence came from Trump's own accountants. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence showing that executives working directly for Trump engaged in a wide variety of maneuvers to evade taxes. Not just one scheme, a wide variety. Multiple schemes, multiple tricks, multiple ways of hiding money and dodging taxes. Executives at the Trump organization engaged in extensive and protracted criminal conduct. That's what the prosecutor said. Extensive, protracted criminal conduct over more than a decade. That's serious. That's not a mistake. That's not an accident.
Might feel like that was the hill they needed to die on. That was the reason they needed to leave the agency. So I have questions about that. The other thing going on, happy April, happy tax season, is that they appeared to just be also kind of wrecking the IRS wholesale in the same way they've been taking apart the Social Security Administration. And I understand the implications of that for Social Security, right? It means disabled people and old people are not going to get the checks they need that pay their rent and pay for their food and pay for their medicine. And in some cases, that's the only income they have. That's why the dismantling and the wrecking of the Social Security Administration is such a five-alarm moral fire for everybody, a five-alarm moral fire for everybody in this country who has a drop of empathy or understanding as to our obligations as citizens to people who have...
That's deliberate, systematic criminal behavior. And here's something that's really significant. During the case, Trump's own lawyers attacked Mazars. Trump's lawyers called Mazars negligent. Trump's lawyers said Mazars should have caught the problems. Trump's lawyers tried to blame the accountants for not catching the fraud. But here's the irony. Mazars had been preparing Trump's returns for years. The IRS had been accepting those returns. The IRS had been relying on Mazars' work. So if Mazars was so negligent, if the returns were so problematic, why did the IRS accept them for all those years? Why didn't the IRS catch the fraud? And the answer is probably that Mazars wasn't that negligent. The answer is probably that the returns were prepared in a way that looked legitimate.
Have paid into Social Security and deserve those benefits and deserve not to be messed with. I get it at the Social Security Administration. At the IRS, we are seeing a similar kind of wrecking ball start to level that administration. I mean, the Trump administration is cutting a quarter of the people who work there. That has implications, among other things, in terms of how much tax revenue is expected to be brought in by the IRS. If tax revenue nationwide drops by 10% because of the way they are wrecking the IRS, what does that do to the country? This happens alongside the Justice Department, talking about now about effectively closing the whole tax enforcement division at the Justice Department, which is the part of the Justice Department that prosecutes tax crimes.
The answer is probably that the fraud was sophisticated enough to fool the IRS for a long time. But once prosecutors got the full picture, once prosecutors had access to the internal documents and the worksheets and the communications, they could see what was really going on. They could see the fraud, and they presented that evidence to a jury, and the jury convicted. And that was the end of it. Trump's company was guilty. Trump's company was convicted of criminal tax fraud. That's a fact. That's a legal determination made by a jury of Trump's peers. That's the law. In early 2022, Mazars actually cut ties with Trump. Mazars said they were no longer going to work with Trump. Mazars said that a decade's worth of financial statements it had compiled for Trump should no longer be relied upon. Should no longer be relied upon. Think about that. That's Mazars saying, we can't stand behind the work we did for you because of all the investigations and all the problems. That's Mazars admitting that there were serious issues with Trump's financial statements. That's Mazars basically saying, we can't trust our own work because of what's coming out. And here's what's really damning about all of this. The IRS is supposed to catch tax fraud. The IRS is supposed to audit wealthy people and complex business entities. The IRS is supposed to enforce tax law, but the IRS hasn't been doing that. In fact, in January 2026, senators published a report saying that IRS investigations into abusive tax schemes dropped 63% in a single year. 63%. That's a massive drop. That's the worst year in more than a decade. And those are the exact kinds of cases that would catch schemes like Trump's. Those are the complex tax cases involving creative accounting and multiple schemes. Those are the cases the IRS should be pursuing. But the IRS isn't pursuing them. The IRS is understaffed. The IRS is under-resourced. The IRS is not investigating complex tax cases the way it used to. So, wealthy tax cheats like Trump are getting away with crimes that would have been caught in the past. The infrastructure for catching tax fraud exists. The laws exist. The authority exists. But the enforcement doesn't exist. The IRS isn't using its resources to go after wealthy people and complex tax schemes. And that means the fraud continues. The conviction happened, the fine was paid, but the tax evasion probably continued in other forms. The off-the-books payments probably continued in some way. The creative accounting probably continued because that's how Trump does business. That's how the Trump organization operates. They find ways to hide money. They find ways to dodge taxes. They find ways to minimize their financial obligations. And those schemes probably continued even after the conviction. The question is not whether more evidence of tax fraud exists. The question is whether prosecutors will pursue it. The question is whether there's political will to go after Trump for tax crimes. The question is whether the IRS will be properly resourced and motivated to investigate complex cases involving wealthy people. And right now, with IRS enforcement at historic lows, the answer is no. Right now, Trump is not facing serious federal tax investigation. Right now, Trump is probably feeling pretty safe from federal tax prosecution. But that could change. That could change very quickly if political conditions change. That could change if a new administration takes office. That could change if Congress decides to fund the IRS. That could change if public pressure builds for accountability. And when it does change, when the infrastructure for serious tax enforcement is turned back on, Trump is very vulnerable because Trump's company was already convicted of tax fraud, because the evidence already exists in the accounting records, because prosecutors already know how to get access to those records, because a jury already found the company guilty. The foundation for prosecution already exists. All that would be needed is the will to prosecute. So Trump probably lies awake at night thinking about IRS audits and DOJ tax prosecutors and subpoenas for his financial records, because Trump probably knows that his company is guilty of tax crimes. Trump probably knows that the accounting records prove fraud. Trump probably knows that if prosecutors get access to those records, more crimes will be revealed. Trump probably knows that the conviction of his company in New York is just the beginning. Trump probably knows that he's vulnerable to much more serious prosecution if the political and legal environment changes. And that's what makes this story so significant, because the machinery for prosecuting Trump for tax fraud already exists. The precedent already exists. The evidence already exists. The conviction already exists. All that's missing is the motivation and the resources to pursue it further. All that's missing is the political will. And that could appear at any moment. That could appear if control of Congress changes. That could appear if a new administration takes office. That could appear if public pressure builds. And when it appears, when the will to prosecute emerges, Trump and his company are going to face very serious consequences because the evidence is overwhelming. The pattern is clear. The crime is documented, and the jury has already said guilty. The case against Trump's company started years ago. Prosecutors started investigating Trump's finances back in 2018. Cyrus Vance, who was the Manhattan district attorney, opened an investigation into Trump's business practices. And Vance's office specifically mentioned that there were public allegations of extensive and protracted criminal conduct at the Trump Organization dating back more than a decade. More than a decade. So prosecutors were aware that the fraud went back a long way. Prosecutors were aware that this was not a recent problem. Prosecutors were aware that the Trump Organization had been engaged in criminal conduct for years. Vance's office went to court and asked for a subpoena to get Trump's tax records from Mazars, and the Supreme Court eventually allowed it. The Supreme Court rejected Trump's attempt to block access to his tax records. The Supreme Court said prosecutors can get the records, and then prosecutors went to Mazars and retrieved 8 years of Trump's tax returns and financial documents. 8 years. Think about that. 8 years of records, 8 years of financial documents, 8 years of worksheets and communications showing how Trump's returns were prepared, and all of that evidence showed fraud. What's interesting is that prosecutors were specifically looking not just at the hush money cases, but at broader financial crimes. Prosecutors were building a case about Trump's overall financial conduct. Prosecutors were investigating whether Trump's company was engaged in systematic fraud. And the tax fraud case was a result of that investigation. The tax fraud conviction was the result of that broader investigation into Trump's financial crimes. The conviction was not just about one person. The conviction was of the Trump Organization itself as an entity, the Trump Corporation, the Trump Payroll Corporation. These are the company entities that Trump owns and controls, and those entities were found guilty of crimes. That means the company itself is criminal. That means the organization itself is engaged in illegal conduct. That's not just about individual bad actors. That's about institutional fraud. That's about how the Trump Organization as a whole operates. One person who was involved in the fraud was Alan Weisselberg, who was Trump's longtime CFO. Weisselberg was caught taking bribes, basically receiving payment for things like apartment rent and cars and school tuition that the company paid for. And Weisselberg pleaded guilty to some of the charges. But the Trump Organization itself was also convicted. The company was found guilty even beyond Weisselberg. So it's not like Weisselberg was acting alone or against the company's interest. The company itself was engaged in the fraud. The company benefited from the fraud. The company created the systems and structures that enabled the fraud. Trump himself was not convicted of any crimes in the tax fraud case. Trump was not charged. Trump did not face criminal prosecution, but Trump's company was convicted. Trump's company was found guilty. And that's significant because it shows that the criminality reaches up through the company structure. The criminal conduct was not just a low-level employee doing something wrong. The criminal conduct was systemic. The criminal conduct was embedded in how the company operated, and Trump, as the owner and ultimate authority in the company, was certainly aware of what was happening. And now, here's where it gets really dangerous for Trump. Because prosecutors have shown that they can get access to Trump's financial records. Prosecutors have shown that they can use those records to prove crimes. Prosecutors have shown that they can convict Trump's company on serious criminal charges. And all of that sets the stage for more prosecutions. All of that creates a roadmap for how other prosecutors could investigate Trump. All of that shows that the evidence of fraud exists in Trump's accounting records. So if a new administration wanted to go after Trump for tax fraud, they would know exactly how to do it. They would know they need to subpoena Trump's financial records from his accountants. They would know they need to get 8 or 10 or 15 years of records. They would know they need to look for off-the-books payments and 2 sets of books and hidden schemes. They would know they need to hire forensic accountants to analyze the records. They would know they need to build a detailed case showing systematic fraud. And they would know they could probably succeed because the Manhattan case already succeeded. The Manhattan case already proved that Trump's company engaged in fraud. The Manhattan case already showed that the records proved the crimes. That's why Trump is probably very concerned about the IRS. That's why Trump probably pushed to cut IRS funding. That's why Trump probably wants the IRS to stop investigating complex tax cases. Because Trump knows that if the IRS gets serious about investigating wealthy people in complex tax schemes, Trump is at the top of the list. Trump's company was already convicted of tax fraud. Trump's accountants already said they can't vouch for his financial statements. Trump's financial records already show extensive criminal conduct. The only thing that's protecting Trump from federal tax prosecution is the fact that the IRS is not currently pursuing these kinds of cases. But that could change. That could change very quickly. That could change if a new administration takes office and decides to prioritize tax enforcement against wealthy people. That could change if Congress decides to fund the IRS properly so it can pursue complex cases. That could change if public pressure builds demanding accountability for tax fraud. And when it does change, when the will to prosecute emerges, Trump is extremely vulnerable. Here's the thing. In New York, the statute of limitations on some of these crimes might be running out. The statute of limitations might be approaching. But under federal law, the statute of limitations on tax fraud is much longer. Federal tax fraud can be prosecuted for many years after the crime was committed. So even if the New York case is the only prosecution Trump faces, even if no other state prosecutes him, the federal government could still go after him for federal tax crimes. The federal government could still prosecute him for violating federal tax law. And the federal government has the resources and the authority to conduct serious investigations. Trump is in a precarious position. Trump is in a vulnerable position. Trump's company was already convicted of criminal conduct. Trump's financial records already show fraud. Trump has no way to deny that the crimes happened because his own company was found guilty by a jury. Trump has no way to claim he didn't know what was happening because the crimes were systematic and embedded in how the company operated. Trump's only protection right now is the fact that the IRS is not enforcing tax law against wealthy people. Trump's only hope is that the IRS remains under-resourced and underfunded. Trump's only chance is that no future administration decides to prosecute him for tax crimes. But that protection could evaporate at any moment. That protection could disappear if political conditions change. That protection could be gone if a new administration takes office. And then Trump will face serious, potentially devastating tax prosecutions. Then Trump will face the possibility of federal charges. Then Trump would face the possibility of prison time because the evidence already exists, because the pattern is already documented, because the infrastructure for prosecution is already in place. All that would be needed is the will to prosecute, and that could appear at any moment. The evidence is clear, the conviction is real, the criminal conduct is documented, and Trump's company is a convicted felon. That's the reality. That's the legal fact. The Trump Organization was convicted of criminal tax fraud. The Trump Organization paid the maximum fine. The Trump Organization's own accountants cut ties with Trump and said his financial statements couldn't be trusted. And the IRS has been systematically underfunded and under-resourced, allowing wealthy tax cheats to escape accountability. But that era might be coming to an end. The political winds might shift. The enforcement machinery might be turned back on. And when it is, Trump and his company are going to face the full weight of federal tax enforcement. They're going to face prosecutors who have access to the same accounting records that the Manhattan DA used to convict the company. They're going to face forensic accountants who can analyze those records and find more fraud. They're going to face juries who will hear the evidence and reach the same conclusion that the Manhattan jury reached. Guilty. The infrastructure for prosecution exists. The evidence exists. The precedent exists. All that's missing is the will. And that will could appear at any time. That's what makes this story so significant. That's what makes Trump so vulnerable. The machinery for accountability is already built. It just needs to be activated. And when it is, Trump's company is going to be convicted again. Trump himself might finally face criminal charges. And the decades of criminal tax fraud that have been documented will finally result in the full accountability that the law demands. The 2018 investigation that Cyrus Vance opened was just the beginning. The 2022 conviction was a significant milestone, but the full story of Trump's criminal tax fraud is not yet complete. There are more records to review. There are more schemes to uncover. There are more crimes to prosecute. And as long as the evidence exists in the accounting records, as long as prosecutors can access those records, as long as the legal infrastructure for prosecution remains in place, Trump remains vulnerable. The IRS investigations into abusive tax schemes dropped 63% in a single year. That's a gift to wealthy tax cheats. That's an opportunity for people like Trump to commit fraud without fear of federal prosecution. But that gift could be revoked. That opportunity could be closed. The IRS could be properly funded and directed to pursue complex tax cases. And when that happens, Trump will be at the top of the list. Trump's company was already convicted. Trump's accountants already said his financial statements couldn't be trusted. Trump's records already show fraud. The evidence is there. The case is ready. All that's missing is the will to prosecute. Trump probably knows this. Trump probably understands that his vulnerability is real. Trump probably lies awake at night thinking about IRS audits and federal prosecutors and the possibility of prison time. Because Trump knows what his company did. Trump knows what his accountants found. Trump knows what the jury said. And Trump knows that it could happen again. It could happen on a federal level. It could happen with more serious consequences. It could happen with prison time on the line. The Manhattan case was a warning shot. The conviction of Trump's company was a message that the legal system can hold Trump accountable for his financial crimes. The maximum fine was a message that the courts take these crimes seriously. And the fact that the evidence came from Trump's own accounting records was a message that the paper trail is there and it can be used to prove fraud. But the Manhattan case was just one jurisdiction, just one set of crimes, just one period of time. There are more crimes to uncover. There are more jurisdictions to prosecute. There is more accountability to be served. And as long as Trump's accounting records exist, as long as prosecutors can access them, as long as the legal infrastructure remains in place, Trump will never be truly safe from prosecution. The IRS is the key. The IRS is the agency that should be investigating complex tax cases. The IRS is the agency that has the resources and the expertise to analyze Trump's financial records and find the fraud. The IRS is the agency that could bring federal charges against Trump for tax crimes. And the IRS is currently underfunded and under-resourced. But that could change. That could change very quickly. And when it does, Trump will face the full weight of federal tax enforcement. That's the reality. That's the vulnerability. That's why this story matters so much. Trump's company was convicted of criminal tax fraud. The evidence is in the accounting records. The infrastructure for prosecution exists. All that's missing is the will. And the will could appear at any moment. That's what makes this situation so dangerous for Trump. That's why Trump is probably terrified of what could happen next. The conviction happened. The fine was paid. But the story is far from over. The full accountability for Trump's decades of criminal tax fraud is still to come. And when it comes, it's going to be devastating.